Douglas's first language is Portuguese, and mine is English. So in the meetings, we often have our laptops out and we use Google Translate in our meetings so that we can understand one another better. And slowly, we're both learning from this. Each week, I learn a little more Portuguese and Douglas learns a little more English. It takes effort to understand people that are different from us, doesn't it? It takes work, doesn't it? Douglas and I take the time to put in the effort to learn how the other person communicates. And in doing so, we rub off on one another. Our skills, our gifts, and our knowledge are transmuted between us through a shared language. And then whatever we're working on ends up better than it could have ever been by working on it ourselves alone. And this is precisely what our story from today that Jason just read from the book of Genesis is all about. There's this pocket of people, this culture, this society. They all speak the same language, and they decide to build a city. And not just a city that covers the land horizontally, but also a city that goes vertical. They build a giant tower. We actually have an actual photograph of the construction here. It was black and white at first, but we had it color corrected. This is an actual, I'm kidding. This is like thousands of years old in case you don't know the story. But this is one artist's depiction of what the Tower of Babel might have looked like while they were building it. And as they're building this giant tower, the story says that God notices it from the heavens, and God says, if as one people speaking the same language, they've begun to do this, then nothing that they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. I've always loved this story. I even loved it as a kid in Sunday school when flannel graph was a thing. Anybody remember flannel graph? The PowerPoint of the 1970s. But whenever I get to this paragraph in this story about the Tower of Babel, I always stop and I think, God had to step in and stop them from doing this. And if God hadn't have done that, they would have finished the tower. That's weird. As with many stories in the Old Testament, it can be really easy to get stuck in the logistics and we miss the lesson. We can get stuck sifting through piles of history and archaeology and anthropology, etc., trying to make sense of a passage, when sometimes doing so won't really help us make sense of it at all. This story's just weird. It's just bizarre. That's just the way it is. This may or may not be exactly how all of this went down, but that's not the point. The point of this story is that God comes down and causes a disturbance. And more importantly, why God causes that disturbance. I don't think this story is a story about a tower at all, but more so a story about human ability, collective human ability. What is possible when people share a language and they work together? The reason that God notices and disturbs these people in this story is so that we will see just how capable we truly are as a people when we work together. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. If they speak the same language and they work together, nothing will be impossible for them. In other words, if we make a continual effort to understand one another and to work together, there's nothing that we can't accomplish together. Nothing. The only force in the cosmos capable of disturbing that, of confusing that, of stopping that, is God. That, to me, is the lesson of this story. In the last decade, has anyone ever heard of the company called Google? Raise your hand. In the last decade, Google has spent millions of dollars measuring nearly every aspect of its employees' lives, from which traits the best managers share to how often particular people eat together. Google was determined to find out how to build the perfect team, and they didn't care what it cost to figure that out. And so the company's executives worked hard on finding the perfect mix of individuals necessary to form the perfect team. They believed that building good teams meant combining the best people. But it wasn't that simple. So in 2012, Google ran a project called Project Aristotle. And it included interviews with hundreds of employees, and they analyzed data about people on more than 100 different teams in the company. And one executive said this: "We looked at 180 teams from all over the company. We had lots of data, but there was nothing showing that a mix of specific personality types or skills or even backgrounds made any difference at all. The who part of the equation didn't seem to matter." Google's collection of this data led to the same conclusions that good managers have always known. In the best teams, members show sensitivity, and most importantly, they listen to one another. Matt Sakaguchi, who's a mid-level manager at Google, commented on Project Aristotle and the things he was asked to put into practice. And he took his team off-site, off of the Google campus, out into the woods or something. And he shared with them about his cancer diagnosis. And although the team was initially disquieted by this, after a time, his colleagues then started opening up about their own lives and sharing their own stories. And at the heart of this strategy, this mid-level manager, Matt Sakaguchi, and Google's findings is the concept of psychological safety. A shared belief that a team is a safe place for interpersonal risk-taking. Google now describes psychological safety as the most important factor in building a successful team. The most important factor in building a successful team. Google ended up discovering what leaders in the business world have known for a long time. The best teams are mindful that all members should contribute to the conversation equally and respect one another's emotions. It has less to do who is in a team and more to do with how the members interact with one another. If as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. If we make a continual effort to understand one another and work together, there's nothing that we can't accomplish. Nothing. What is it in your life today that you want to accomplish? What is it if you're a leader in a company or a leader of a company? What is it in your company today that you want to accomplish? What is it in your team at work that you want to accomplish? What do you want to accomplish in a relationship or in your family? What if you don't get there by tracking and tasks only, but also by trusting others? What if you don't get there by strength and stamina and skill set alone, but also by surrendering to and sharing your story with others? Could that be what makes, as Jesus said in the Gospels, all things possible to those who believe? The belief not being this superstition that if we just pray right or have the right kind of faith that God does something about it, but the belief that we have in one another and the God in one another that begins to do things among us that we never thought were possible because we do them together. If we make a continual effort to understand one another and work together, there's nothing that we can't accomplish. Absolutely nothing. Let's pray.